We're good to go, Matt. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If I could just introduce myself for those who haven't visited any of our lectures in the autumn of 2020. I'm Ken Smith. I'm the president of the Royal Archaeological Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our January lecture. Now, before we get going, I'd just like to say that we have had some issues over people asking questions via the chat function of the YouTube facility. You can ask questions via that facility during the lecture, but it is our experience that it might be better to wait towards the end, because sometimes questions asked in the middle are then answered later on in the presentation. I think where people have had problems in the past in asking questions via that YouTube medium, it's because you need to be a YouTube account holder, we believe. So if you aren't, I'm afraid you'll just have to sit back and relax and watch and listen, but you won't be able to ask any questions, unfortunately. Now, as advertised, it was going to be Angela Wardle who would be giving this lecture this evening, but because of health issues, she's had to withdraw. We wish her a speedy recovery and hope that she can appear for us at some point in the future. So we haven't lost her presentation altogether, we hope. But at short notice, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Peter Halkon, who's going to talk to us about Petuaria Revisited this evening. Peter is Senior Lecturer in Archaeology in the Department of History at the University of Hull. He has long-term interests in the Iron Age and Roman periods in Eastern Yorkshire, and is author of recent books, one, The Parisi, Britons and Romans in Eastern Yorkshire, which was published in 2013 by the History Press, and a 2020 publication by Oxbow Books, The Arras Culture of Eastern Yorkshire, Celebrating the Iron Age, which is the proceedings of the RAI's conference in York in 2017. So it's really good to see that published. He's currently the lead archaeologist in the community heritage project Petuaria Revisited, aimed at researching Roman Brough-on-Humber. And that's effectively the title of his presentation tonight, Petuaria Revisited, New Light on Roman Brough-on-Humber. So without further ado, Peter, it's over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ken, and good evening, everybody. As Ken said, the purpose of tonight is to give you a background on our lecture, our project. As you can see from the opening picture, this was a remarkable success that we were able to ever do the project in the first place, as it was in the lull in the COVID pandemic. And first of all, enormous thanks to Tim Caldwell, who's the Health and Safety Officer at the University of Hull, and Dr. Nick Somerton, who's a GP based in Brough, who also did risk assessments and similar things for the Ramblers Association, North Yorkshire National Parks, and also for Dermot of the Services Archaeological and Heritage organisation, who manned security and also provided advice. It's very helpful having a medical officer from the army helping one out on an excavation. Just in case anybody gets worried, although this shows the whole team, only 12 people or less were allowed in the trench at any one time. But we decided for this photograph to assemble the whole team of all sorts of various ages. But I'll talk about that community involvement later on. So there's some debate as to the first appearance of Brough in the archaeological record. And this is one of the earliest references. Abraham de Leprine, who's a curate at what's now Hull Minster, once Holy Trinity Church in Hull, wrote a very detailed diary. He was pretty good at antiquarian, and in this he is replying to a letter which includes the report of the discovery of a coin very similar to the one shown here in the picture. Now, this text is really quite interesting because it provides evidence that even then there was little surviving above ground of Brough. And it also misdates the linear earthworks that were leading from it. He talks about 3 huge banks towards the bottom of that paragraph. And these are almost certainly some of the great linear earthworks across the Yorkshire walls. Moving on in time, we've got here in Britannia Romana a visit of Horsley in 1732, who describes Roman foundations and comments on their position close to the River Humber, and this idea of it being a crossing point, as indeed Abraham the Prime did in the previous text that I just showed. Much debate was carried out about what the place names in the various Roman documents, such as the Notitia and Ptolemy's geography and such like, where were these places? And here in this rather beautiful map from Drake's Iberocum, you can actually see that Petuaria is placed here somewhere in the middle of the Yorkshire wolds. Now, we're uncertain about a number of places, but interestingly, he follows some of the current thinking, placing Deventio not necessarily at Malton, where it's usually been placed, but at Stamford Bridge. I'm not sure about the location of Camelot Dunham, but Pete Wilson will probably supply a bit more information about that one. I love this map. Notice the little Roman ships shown in the North Sea. Notice as well an attempt to illustrate the Roman roads. And although Brough is shown, there's no real clue in Drake's mapping of its archaeological significance. One of the big problems about Brough is the opportunity to do much work has already long been lost. And these few maps that I'm going to show you now show how Brough has been built up through time. So here we are in one of the early editions of the Ordnance Survey, 1852, published 1855. And you can see it's but a small village. And key, though, are the Burrs Playing Field here, and these medieval burgage plots around here, because Walter de Grey, who's a famous Archbishop of York, actually owned Brough at one stage. And he might be responsible for the removal of quite a lot of the stonework. There is very little to see of Brough compared to any other Roman town of its stature, but a ditch on the far side of the present Burrs Playing Field and some vestige of a bank. We can see how Brough begins to build up. This is the 1910 version. The Burrs is still there, and you can see Roman coins and other finds mentioned. The railways arrived with other buildings associated with it, and you can see the gradual build-up along the roads. Moving on now, we're into 1953, and the arrival of the aircraft factory, which arrived during the war. It was once owned by private company Blackburns, then taken over by Hawker Siddeley, and then eventually BAE, and BAE reducing their input on the site at the moment. And this is one of the reasons why we were so eager to get the Petuaria Revisited project off the ground. So much of what I'm going to say relies on really one of my archaeological heroes, who was no stranger to Burlington House, in that he was the secretary of the Society of Antiquaries. Starts off as a school teacher at Bootham School in York, and also got together a group of like-minded individuals who explored the archaeology of the Roman period in Eastern Yorkshire. And this is a wonderful photograph of one of his seasons of excavation in August 1936 of his small digging team. And the person who really did all the work is Bertie Gott, shown here with the tank top. Philip Corder's suitably dressed with his blazer and collar outside his jacket, as of the fashion. And he's got long socks and long shorts. And the lady in white here, again, very suitably dressed for an archaeological excavation, is Mary Kitson Clark, or Mary Derwas Chitty, as she became. Very important figure in the archaeology of Eastern Yorkshire, because she produced the first gazetteer of Roman remains. It also shows a long connection with what was then University College of Hull, with the region's archaeology, and the local history committee set up this excavation committee. They achieved an enormous amount, mainly due to the drive and expertise of Philip Corder, who, as you will see, was way ahead of his time in many ways. They found a conquest period fort, a later fort, the walled enclosure, and most importantly, the theatre inscription RIB 707. One of the finds is illustrated here, and courtesy of Hull and East Riding Museums for these photographs. These show local dignitaries being shown round one of Corder's excavations. And you can see here the foundations of one of the bastions, which he illustrated in his yearly pamphlets, which are really done to an excellent standard and really very quickly, complete with reports on all the small finds and pottery. Some of the finds made in those excavations, which hopefully eventually one will be able to see in the Hull and East Riding Museum once COVID is over. And for those of you who haven't been, do go. It's a superb collection and has some of the best Roman mosaics in the north of England. Another range of objects, some peculiarly interesting ones, such as this pipe clay figurine, half a head, and the closest parallels to those are in France. And the one I particularly like is this miniature anvil. And there are a growing number of finds in Eastern Yorkshire to do with smithing, and it's possible these equate to a regional cult associated with Vulcan. The most significant find that Bertie Gott actually dug up, and the location shown on the diagram, was this famous theatre inscription. Found in 1937, and this is a photograph showing it in situ, or in situ in the excavation. And there is great debate as to where it actually came from. As one can see from the rectilinear building illustrated in Corder's excavation, that is clearly not the shape of a theatre. We've also got this rather peculiar arrangement at the east gate as well. But the illustration here also shows Corder's method of excavation with these long, narrow trenches. And when he found something which he thought of interest, they opened out a larger area. So here's the inscription itself. And I'll quickly read the translation here. For the honor of the divine house of the Emperor Caesar Aelius Hadrianus Antoninus Augustus, father of his country, consul, and to the spirit of the Augusti. So it gives us a reasonable date in the 140s. Who put it up? Well, Marcus Ulpius Januarius. aedile of the vicus of. And this is a bit of a problem because our key bit of this inscription is damaged, but we can see a P, the top part of an E, a T, and part of a U. And as we know, there's a place, the Ptolemy places in Eastern Yorkshire, Petuaria, it seems a reasonable presumption. And what does he do? He dedicates a proscenium at an expense. Clearly as aedile, responsible for various duties involving public buildings and such like. He was probably touting for another term in office, and this was his way of gaining votes, I suppose, or whatever. Another controversy as to what this pattern here means is C. Some people have argued it's a C for civitates or civitas, and there should be a P on the other side, but this we don't know. We have actually got the name of what Brough was, its status, in here, vicus. Now this has caused an enormous debate, and John Waiter actually wrote this, calling it a red herring which has misled archaeologists. And John went on to suggest that Brough may not have been the capital after all, it may have been the Red Cliff at North Ferriby. But Crichton, Willis and Crowther's work, Pete Didsbury's work as well at the Red Cliff, following the Wrights' work much earlier, who originally found the site, is pretty clear that it is not a Civitas capital. And certainly the evidence, as we'll see, makes Brough a pretty good client for this status. Another remarkable discovery made by Corder was this burial. In 1936, a male who was very tall, 5'9" or 1.75 meters, in a coffin, and he's found with a scepter, which has deliberately been bent, with this classical helmeted figure on the scepter, but a bucket with this very Iron Age Celtic, if I may use the word, looking mount with the slick back hair and drooping moustache, all the elements of the stereotypical Iron Age warrior. I love the paleopathological report though. Sir Arthur Keith, who looked at this, writes, he had a large head and jaws degenerate and was therefore of the squire class. I don't think we'd quite get away with writing something like that these days. However, notice it was in the Antiquity Journal and put there in 1938. So you can follow that one up. The finds are in the Hull and East Riding Museum. The next work in Brough was done by John Waiter. This is a picture of him soon after his Brough excavations, actually at Cirencester. But what he was doing basically was a bit of rescue archaeology before the construction of a pipeline, which you can see on the illustration on the right-hand side here. But he too was able to open up a couple more trenches in large garden areas as well. And here's one of them, Brough House. And you can see the various phases of one of the main entrances and his hypothetical reconstruction showing how grand he thought that the gateway was. Little happened really until the 1970s when Peter Armstrong, who was then based at Hull Museums, later to work for the Humberside Archaeology Unit, led the East Riding Archaeological Society in various excavations at Cave Road in Brough. And you can see in the background of these slides, and Peter supplied these many years ago, a drop off in the landscape. And remarkable remains here. And Peter passed on the archive to Martin Millett, and we're working on looking at the 80 boxes of Roman pottery that came from these trenches. An unusual structure, as you can see from the photographs. And this is Peter's site plan of what was going on. You see something of the scale. And we were able, thanks to both ground penetrating radar by David Stabley and magnetometer survey by my colleague in this exercise, James Lyle of geophys.biz, who did the magnetometer survey to show that this site could be even more extensive than hitherto thought. And it is just possible that we're looking at perhaps part of a Roman port or something of the like, as it borders right on to the Walling Fen, which was then a tidal inlet. Now it's rich farmland, as we'll see later on in this talk. Now, my own involvement in Brough starts in 1980, when I came back to the region, having studied history and medieval history and archaeology at Liverpool, qualified, did teacher training at York and got my first job as a classroom teacher in Hull. And although I was already a member of the East Riding Archaeological Society, rejoined more vigorously. And we took over Peter Armstrong's work in Brough before Gordon Cates built a number of houses. Sadly, a lot of the archive of this site has gone missing. I was only a very junior member of the squad, shown here actually in the brown shirt, excavating. But what we did show is that Brough extended far beyond the walled enclosure. And what we're probably looking at is the annex of the first fort, dating from the possible invasion period from in the 70s. And we got some very nice mint quality coins of Domitian and Nerva, which also provide some interesting dating evidence. Gordon Cates also found an iron tire. Unfortunately, we weren't able to follow this up, and it's just possible that we've got a destroyed chariot burial on the site, but there's no other evidence for that. But equally, it could be in a Roman context. Another view here of the excavations. Over here, you see a few slabs, but it's pretty clear that what we have there is some kind of rampart base. But the nicest and clearest finds are shown here. We've got a late 1st century military type oven, and several coins were found on top of this and cut through by Blackburn's company swimming pool, this very nice Roman threshold. As we'll see from the mapping, Brough is really much more extensive than has previously been thought. The next work is partly due again to Martin Millett. One of his students at Durham University conducted a resistivity survey, and this is from his dissertation. And the stippled area in Burrs Field shows the areas which he detected high resistance features. So there's clearly a roadway of sorts running through here and up here, and also other features running in various other directions as well. The biggest excavation, I think, probably to date, although there's been some new excavations carried out more recently, developer funded. Well, this one was done by Kurt Unterman on behalf of the York Archaeological Trust at Welton Road. This is published in Internet Archaeology. Roman buildings and the Roman road, corn dryers, cremation and inhumation burials, animal burials as well, and far less intense activity than found further to the west. However, very useful new information about Brough. And Pete produced this plan showing areas of Roman activity. Up until 2019, we've got Karen Adams excavating on Welton Road. And to the south of the railway line, we've had another large project on what was the former airfield as well. So summarizing the information as per last year, this shows the general spread of finds. Not everything. These are the ones which had a very firm location for that I was able to impose onto an ArcGIS map. The red shows the early fort and the black, the walled enclosure. We've got the road shown there and the little temple-like structures aren't lots of Roman temples, but in fact, a nice icon illustrating definite Roman buildings. But one can see immediately the extent is probably much larger than was previously thought. Notice as well the former tidal inlet and our site on Cave Road shown by this outlier structure is right on the edge of this tidal inlet. Very important because one must remember that we're looking at the Humber. And the Humber is one of the most difficult estuaries in Britain. And we've got evidence from York, of course, for a Humber pilot of the attack to the 6th Legion. And there's an air photograph I took in 2015. And you can see here the curvature of the various field boundaries. And these represent various reclamation of this former tidal estuarine inlet. Created twice, once in the Neolithic, Mesolithic cut. It was terrestrialized during the Bronze Age, and then at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of Iron Age, a major incursion, marine incursion, creates this tidal estuarine inlet, which continues through into the Roman period. And that is the main reason for the location of Brough, halfway up the Humber estuary at a convenient point from which one could access the river systems to the north as well. Particularly the Ouse, of course, with York only a few tens of kilometers upriver. The main areas I'll be talking about is here. This is the Burrs Playing Field, otherwise known as the Bosses Field. Bosses is peculiar, we're not quite sure how that developed, but it could be East Riding dialect, a corruption of Burrs, which in itself, of course, is derived from the word Brough, meaning Roman remains, fort or whatever. Cave Road is this road running up here. And here we have on our Ordnance Survey map the areas we'll be talking about. Here's the core of the Roman centre, the Burrs Playing Field. Petuaria Close, we've just seen that 1980 excavation. And thanks to David Staveley and James Lyle, we're able to do more geophysics there out of the scheduled area this year. And also the site at Cave Road around about here. But remarkably, one product of COVID, for all its bad points, the golf was sadly stopped. And this allowed, thanks to the very obliging staff at the golf course, to allow a full geophysical survey of the majority of the golf course. So really, this starts the project. Now, the history is partly due to my own interest, but also a lot of credit must go to Mr. Martin Credland, who until last year was chair of the Allerton-cum-Brough Town Council, but is still chair of the Playing Field Association. very keen on Roman archaeology, a former member of the East Riding Archaeological Society. He was, in his period as head of the town council, was very eager to make Brough a major place to people to visit. Very ambitious of the so little to see of Roman Brough, but nonetheless we had to start somewhere. Also to give the town some focus as BAE Systems reduced its influence on the town. Although I must say BAE has been a major sponsor for our projects. So basically the PFA wanted to put in new play equipment into the site here, into the playing field. And of course, it was difficult, it's a scheduled ancient monument. So I suggested that before anything else was done, we should get a Section 42 license. And again, thanks to Keith Emmerich of Historic England, the inspector, for providing the license for James to carry out this magnetometer survey. And so far, this is what's been done from 2014 to 2020. And thanks to Mike Halkon of the Roman Roads Research Trust for allowing us to use these equipment, and also he and James have trained local volunteers in its use. And we've got some really quite superb results. But our main focus is going to be on the Burrs. Superimposed on Google Earth, you can see here Corder's map of the site. And on the right-hand side screen, we've got James's magnetometer survey. We got quite excited about this, but slightly disappointed as it didn't match in sharpness or quality anything like James Rose Ferriby and Martin's work at Aldborough, for example. But nonetheless, it showed that there was far more there than John Wacher had suggested. And certainly, as things some things mapped exactly on Corder, it showed great potential. For example, in the area here towards the bottom part of the picture, we've got two square buildings which clearly map on to a large geophysical anomaly. We can also see other features like the roadways, which were already shown in the resistivity survey, running diagonally here and up here. We wanted another way of looking through the soil, therefore, and we were able, thanks to the setting up of Petuaria Revisited and generous donations by a whole host of people who will acknowledge at the end, to get David Staveley up from Eastbourne, who basically does ground penetrating radar and other geophysics in his spare time, who generally gave a lot of time as well to come up and do his GPR. For those who don't know how GPR works, we've got this illustration here which shows that radar is sent off from transmitters reflected back into the machine, and it produces in effect these time slices, which by clever computing, and David wrote some software himself, can be all stitched together to form a 3D visualization of what's under the ground, which I'm going to show you now. So we start off with a football pitch and gradually go down through various phases, and suddenly clarity. I'll run this through twice to give you a chance to have a look in more detail. And one can instantly see a huge wealth of Roman remains. We're going down, we're below 1.5 meters now. And I'll quickly run through this again. Oops. Notice the fuzziness here. I'll explain this in a moment. And then suddenly we get clarity as the features began to appear. Look particularly at this bottom left area, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute. So here's the whole thing, obviously with Section 42 license. And we can see one phase. A line of the defences running through here, but notice as well this feature here, which almost certainly represents really a very, very substantial ditch. And it could be that we are looking at parts of the fort, the earliest, an earlier fort. We've got here a major roadway, and one can see a whole series of buildings situated end on to the roadway, particularly this very large structure here towards the centre, another series of structures here, a couple of roadways running up here, and particularly this one here, this D-shaped structure inside what appears to be a courtyard-shaped building. Again, other features showing here, further down the stratigraphy, which match with what Corder discovered. And focusing on this, you can quite clearly see why we got rather excited about this structure, as it does resemble very much in shape a Roman theatre. One obviously though was its position within this courtyard type structure. And here it is again. And we're able, thanks again to Historic England and the Secretary of State for granting the license, and to all our funders, we're able to set about at the end of August and into September, carrying out a 17-day excavation. And this red line shows the area that we excavated. And so topsoil stripping, we're brilliantly supported by the local community. And to the extent that New Lawn, a civil engineering company within Brough, provided their digger drivers free, both for stripping off the topsoil and for infilling, although of course we can't guarantee this every time. And you can see James there supervising the topsoil stripping. I took the photograph. It was clear that there'd been quite a lot of disturbance on the site, and some quite nice pieces of pottery were coming up in the surface. Again, the GPR, and you can see, and I'll put a larger scale version of this, one of the early phases of the excavation and the total matchup between the GPR and the excavation result. You can see one of the walls of this courtyard building coming across here and so on. The dark are negative kind of features, and the lights here are stone features. And you can see the foundation bits of this wall apparently running across here, and also part of the curve of this structure coming through. Well, first stage of excavation, getting nice straight edges. So here we've got the digging team cleaning back the edges, and then the mass troweling exercise, socially distanced troweling, of course. And you can see Johnny Farley, my PhD student, talking to passers-by. There's very much community, as we'll see later on. And all the time, we had people explaining, at safe distances, of course, what was going on. We got phenomenal interest from people taking that daily exercise. So what did we find? Well, this shows a more detailed photograph of that same phase of features. Feature at the top, which is a more detailed hearth structure, and then various stone structures which match the ground penetrating radar features. And here, thanks to Tom Sparrow, these are stills from a wonderful 3D photogrammetry which Tom at Bradford University did for us, but the three main phases of the excavation. And these are viewable eventually in 3D. I think one of them is certainly available on our Petuaria Revisited Facebook page, and I think our website. So I'll quickly explain the features. We've got a hearth area, this stone spread in the center, this earthy phase here, more rubble running across in this direction, and then a trench across at the back here. This phase through the hearth feature, which is the latest Roman feature on the site. And then we've got, again, the rubble spread and this feature wall-like structure running through here, but only a couple of, if that, the course is thick here, but running more or less on the line of the D, the back of the D of the geophysical anomaly. And finally, underneath this pretty massive wall structure running through here under these phases. And we're looking here at well below a meter depth before you reach the top of this structure. And there's clearly much material below this. Here we've got a very interesting part of the site as well. We've got wall trenches at each side of what proved to be a floor upon which was a load of painted wall plaster. So we'll go through the site on the ground, as it were. The hearth structure you can see here. We had a burnt coin of the House of Constantine inside that. We've also got this rubble spread over here as well, and the wall of the footings trench, the hearth here, you can see the rubble spread at the center and the foundational stone base coming up here. Now, I did mention the fuzziness of the magnetometer survey, which is caused by this orangey yellow layer here, which is limestone brought in from North Newbold stone quarries in the 1970s when the site was transformed from a arable land into a playing field. Leveling was started and JCBs or bulldozers came in, started leveling the site, and the sharp eyes of passing members of the East Riding Archaeological Society and some local residents immediately alerted the Ministry of Works that damage was being done to the site. They came in and stopped work, and strategies were set out to preserve the buried remains. And so over about 6 months, lorry loads of limestone were brought in and spread over the site, which obscured the magnetometer readings, but did a pretty good job of protecting the Roman remains. Here again, you can see the foundation trenches of one of the cells of the courtyard building. And Alison Spencer here is troweling across the floor surface after the removal of a whole wall of painted wall plaster in terrible state of disrepair. Very, very fragmentary, and it would have been virtually impossible without a colossal amount of funding. And the Archaeological Trust said that it takes 7 years to put this back together again properly. And so we thought, well, we'll try and rescue it as best as we can and come up with a method of preserving a small section. One can see an upturned piece. This is the back. Notice all the grooves on it that you can see here. This caused by some kind of backing. And thanks to Jim Mooring, a local builder, we were able to lift a section. Max Felter of the Archaeological Trust had come over to advise, And we tried by putting PVA to solidify a bit more, but we weren't able to do so. So all we were able to do was look at the better preserved piece, and Jim was able to plaster the back. We got from the first aid box and bandaging, and we were able here to lift the section. Rather disappointing that it was basically a cream color with a red stripe on it, and that was all. However, it does show the status of the building. There were more varied colors available as well, however, which shows that whoever was using the building was of considerable status. Other finds, hypercourse tiles and stone roof tiles as well, confirm its status. So here's the core of that large wall that I mentioned earlier on, thoroughly robbed. We only got about 2 or 3 ashlar stone facing blocks from the whole excavation. You can see again clearly here the covering protective layer. Now to the finds, and we were able to find a colossal amount of material in such a relatively small trench. And thanks to Dermot and Reb Ellis, another Hull PhD student, and John Deverell, who are our finds team, were able to catalog and collate, wash everything. We used volunteers and passers-by, said, oh, can we join in? And we gave them various jobs. We had a 100% civiling program of all the archaeological deposits as well. That's just a selection of the kind of finds. And coins, this is one of the earliest coins that was found. A denarius of Julia Domna, with her portrayed as our Venus on the back. And a coin of Carausius. And we have a cluster of coins of Carausius and Electus from Brough. This is quite important. John Wakeshire had suggested Brough's function as a naval base, followed up by Brian Sitch, who analysed the coins from Brough in the 1980s and suggested a definite peak. Now, Carausius, of course, was in charge of the Roman fleet and was a usurper emperor. And it is just possible that those massive walls, and I showed the bastion earlier on, were the enclosure of part of the town and its transformation into a naval base. Constantian coins, such as this one here with a Lugdunum Leon mint mark. Believe it or not, the very first buckets full of topsoil taken off by the digger produced this sherd, which is almost certainly in the plough soil, at least the top of it was, and it is Cranbeck painted parchment ware. And Pete no doubt will correct me on this one, but it's probable that it only starts in production in AD 340 and continues to the end of Roman Britain, possibly beyond 400. This showed immediately that it's likely that some of the ideas about Brough having already closed were going to be wrong, especially as we found Huntcliffe ware as well. That's the rather crude, hand-thrown, wheel-finished, hooked rim cooking pots and storage jars. Another intriguing find, and many thanks to Dr. Stephen Greek for looking at the small finds for us. But here's an oyster shell. We found a huge quantity of oyster shells on the site, as one would expect. There are almost certainly oyster beds in the Roman period very close by in the Humber estuary. There certainly are mapped on the early Ordnance Survey maps. And this is graffiti actually on the inside of an oyster shell, which you can just make out here. But in order to make it more visually accessible, we fiddle about with various lighting, and you can see clearly crisscross pattern and diamond pattern, and you can just about make out an X here and a 1. Depending on which way round that is, it's either a 11 or a 9. And James made a joke about it being a theatre ticket for a particular seat. Very nice object here, and thanks again to Dr. Stephen Greep for identifying it. It is a bone needle case, and I find very typical of the later part of the third and into the, early part of the 4th and possibly even into the early 1st century, late Roman object. And we've got this very nice ring and dot ornamentation. We know the needle cases because one of these found with actually the iron needles within this part. Not in this case, it was just hollowed, but a very nice artifact. And we found bone pins as well. Other nice artifacts, the small but perfectly formed late Roman assemblage, a jet button, jet bangle fragment, and not a bone or antler, I can't remember quite which at the moment, counter. And really fascinating was this, a crossbow type brooch and this late Roman buckle with decayed leather. One regards those kind of crossbow brooches as relating to people like these, late Roman infantry and limitani, certainly on the Rhine frontier, where many of these types of brooches have been found. Or they could also be associated with late Roman officials. And here you can see Secundus wearing one of these, and also this reenactor. So it seems pretty reasonable to hypothesize that here in late Roman Brough, possibly associated with the continued use of that walled enclosure, we had troops looking much like this. On to the final part of the talk, the community involvement. And as I said, we're extremely lucky in having such a vigorous chair, Martin Credland. And we also got the services of Legio Six Victrix, a York-based group of reenactors, although Martin over here is in fact a Hull resident. And we got, at last, huge interest from the civic authorities in the town council. And here's Councillor Pat Smith, who's the chair of the of the East Riding of Yorkshire Council, who visited the site on our civic day. And here we've got the Lord Mayor of Hull and consort, and behind him the Mayor of Heddon as well. And we also got the head of arts and cultures from the East Riding of Yorkshire Council. It's been somewhat of a mission of mine over many, many years to make the local authority realise what riches it has in terms of archaeology. And those of you who are able to attend the wonderful conference in York a few years ago will have been made very clear about the spectacular Iron Age discoveries. We're anxious to involve all members of the community and of all ages as well. And various people came along with the children. Children were eager to join in, as one can see here, and people of all ages. We had very strict guidelines. This is mother and son here, and notice mask wearing. At that stage, it was recommended you only wore masks if you were going to within 2 meter intervals, but we tried where possible to get people to wear masks. We also had a program of public outreach, and Johnny Farley, again, is doing a PhD partly based on Petuaria Revisited from the archaeological point of view, and partly from presentation of heritage as well. But they did a sterling job on informing the many, many passers-by who came, as one can see. James Lyle, my co-director and longtime colleague, also helped as well. And we had passing children and really tremendous input, as this graph shows. All sorts of different groups. We got people from out of the area, novices, people who'd never done any digging before. So 55 of the people who participated had never done any digging before. Got people out of the area. We got a large amount of local people coming to dig as well, and so on. So over the lifetime of the excavation, I think we got 60 people actually actively participating in the dig, and we got over I think our biggest day in terms of visitors was over 100. So what conclusions can we bring? Well, sadly, we found no absolutely obvious signs of the theatre, but as we've seen, in some phases, the excavated contacts match the GPR anomaly, but there is still over a metre to go before natural is reached, according to Corder's excavation, which is undertook just outside our excavation trenches. It was pretty clear that that site had been very heavily robbed of its stone. Quite by whom we're not sure. Corder identified it as a stone that was listed in the documents for the early medieval town of Hull, but subsequent inquiry has shown that the stone may actually be quarried from nearby Brough. I'm still not sure this needs to be followed up. Certainly, there's quite a lot of building stone found in the foundations of the medieval walls of Hull, which of course famously are in brick. But it's been heavily robbed of stone. And one of the most exciting elements was this flourishing late Roman activity, which is hinted at in Corder's 1937 excavation. And this rather spectacular and well-appointed courtyard building, despite its almost complete demolition. We were not expecting to find, 3/4 of the wall of albeit extremely fragmentary wall plaster, along with those other finds. There's evidence of a substantial building below it as well, and certainly potential for a hypercourse. And again, rewriting the history of Roman Britain, I suppose, to some extent, possibly a continuation of the Saxon shore fort idea, going up the Humber, halfway between the mouth of the Humber estuary at Spurn Point and York, with a fortification in the Burrs protecting what is also the confluence of the rivers Ancombe and Trent and up to the Ouse. So a real key point in the eastern entry to Britain. And finally, a highly successful community engagement. And here we have revealed, masked off, but socially distant. It's really hard taking a group photograph when you've got to be 2 meters apart. But this was our best way of showing it. And in the foreground, there is Martin Cradland, who we owe so much to for his great enthusiasm in getting this off the ground, and our wonderful digging team. So I'd like to acknowledge, first of all our volunteers, without whom this would not have been possible. The only two people actually being paid on the site were myself and James. All the rest were volunteers, and great expertise, however, from my former BA archaeology part-time graduates. And many, many thanks to all our sponsors, of course, including yourselves, the Royal Archaeological Institute, all listed there. Also, of course, to the Roman Roads Research Trust, who were able to supply our equipment. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a really interesting run through the product of a relatively small trench. I was going to mention, as you hadn't already, but you did in the end, of course, that there had been some RI grant funding.
Yeah.
But it's perhaps worth some of our audience recognizing that one of the criteria that we apply is the degree to which community engagement is achieved through excavations. And it's pretty obvious from both the figures and from the pictures that you've got a really large amount of community engagement, community support, and community involvement. So that's really good to see. Yes, you didn't find the theatre. Admittedly, you've got a metre to go, but presumably in that relatively small area, you had no indication of what the function of what that apparent D-shaped enclosure might be?
Not really. I mean, it is possible that it is still there. We've got a metre to go before the the contemporary deposits. And as it's so heavily robbed, I'm not sure what we can expect to find. Our trench perhaps could have been more centrally positioned, because although I've stopped sharing, there was a screen, so perhaps I ought to do that again. I'll just get my screen back up. Sorry, there we go. If we look quickly back at the here, you can see this bit sticking out here, the center of the D. We were a bit reluctant in our first job, first dig here, to go right for the center first time. We didn't know what to expect. So, we veered slightly off, going straight for the center. It could be that this is part of the proscenium.
Sure.
There was one possibility as well that I put forward, I think, in the Britannia article that appeared in the last issue of Britannia, that it could be a cavea type structure inside a courtyard building, which could be the council chamber, because we've got a precedent in the Balkans for this kind of bouleuterian type in the Greek world for this kind of structure inside a courtyard building. So that was another alternative, but certainly nothing like Verulamian theatre, which we were hoping for initially. But David Staveley still thinks there's a possibility, but as you can see, there is a direct correlation between the stone feature here, the stone here, and this curvature.
Sure.
And it's interesting that we've got I talk about that central rubble layer here, which is bang on this.
Yes.
So perhaps we've got the last vestige. And if one thinks about where the inscription was found, right at the other side of the field, again, if we go back to, this one will do, the theatre inscription was found over, if you get the mouse pointing over here. And it seems to me very likely that when this wall went in and it was all remodeled, that clearly that wall is cutting right through something going underneath.
Sure.
Or maybe that part of the Roman town, or whatever it was deliberately taken over and militarized, and probably maintained that function perhaps to the rest of the period of Roman Britain. And our courtyard building may perhaps have some kind of military function, as we certainly have got our crossbow brooch found there, our military style buckle, and we also have and Pete, who kind of visited the site, suggested dumping a material over a courtyard, the courtyard area, suggesting later use with parallels in Catterick and elsewhere for this period. And perhaps Bolton as well more recently.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting comment. I mean, the throwaway line in a sense that the imposition of that enclosing wall, defensive barrier, whatever, would presumably necessitate the raising of any buildings, any structures on the outside immediately, in order if it was a defensive wall.
Yeah, it's very likely.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, of course, apart from Courton-to-Man's excavation, we've lost that opportunity.
Sure. Sure.
There is still some option to the north of Welton Road in some of the very large gardens, but we've, I'm afraid, got little chance of finding out very much more. And it's fortunate that we've still got this large open space where, although it's a scheduled monument, where we can hopefully carry out a bit more work. And of course, we are intending to excavate next summer. And what our main idea, as you know, is to continue to excavate downwards and see what turns up, and perhaps solve this question of the theatre. But I would like to come back and excavate, now we know what to expect, across that projecting feature within the centre of the D-shaped anomaly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Peter. I wonder if we have any questions from any of our audience. Matt, is there anything there? Okay. Pete, do you have any comment or query of Peter?
You can tell me if I've got it wrong, if you're still awake, that is.
Yes, I am awake, Peter. Basically, this project is actually turning our understanding of Brough on its head. I very briefly looked at Brough when I did a paper for John Waite's Festschrift, revisiting his work on Roman towns of Yorkshire. And we were looking at one of these mythical empty Roman towns almost. And John, as you said, really did not regard it as an urban centre. But what you've managed to do in that one single trench is actually add incredibly to our understanding of what is going on. We have deep deposits, we have substantial buildings, we have long occupation. Okay, yes, we do have John's military element, which you've reinforced. That it's this season, yeah, okay, maybe you're going to get into the D-shaped structure, maybe you're going to understand it. But even if you don't, you've actually added considerably to what we know. And as somebody with a passing interest in Roman Yorkshire, I'm very, very grateful, personally.
Thanks, Pete.
Well, so am I. Again, I'd like to again thank the Society, the Royal Archaeology Institute, for their generous funding that made this possible, along with the other groups as well.
And I think that's although obviously your presentation, sadly in many ways, is because Angela wasn't able to do hers, I think it's really useful for members to be able to see the kind of project to which their funds are put, and the kind of outputs and results that contribution helps to produce, and that community engagement, and that that reinforcing the watchfulness that the local community has had over this area in the past. And okay, it's maybe used as a playing field in the main, but it's that very community use that has in many ways preserved it to enable you to do the work that you're doing now, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But I must say, from my perspective, it's the relationship between that defensive wall and the settlement that precedes it that I find the most fascinating. So perhaps that's some way down the line.
Stage.
Mm.
It is possible to say something else about the community of Brough-on-Humber. It is actually down to them that we have the site surviving.
Exactly.
There was basically, Peter knows this better than me, but there was massive dumping on the site, and and works associated with that. Then, I suppose, at that stage, Ministry of Works.
Yes, the Ministry of Works
were alerted to this basically completely unknown threat through the good offices of the people of Brough-on-Humber.
Yeah, grateful to them way back. Okay, Matt, have any questions appeared? Can I ask? Right. Does that? Okay. Anything warrant comment, Peter, on that observation?
So whereabouts was that again, Matt?
Yes.
Right,
It's
Pete.
another project which the RAI has supported. It's a rather enigmatic site which has been dug by the Swaledale and Garthdale Archaeological Group over a number of years, which has military associations because in terms of actually being involved in military supply. It's a very, very different situation. Obviously, this is in the heart of Yorkshire Dales, so high up on the shoulder of one of the valleys. But no, it's a certainly valid comment in terms of what has come from that site. And but it's obviously a very, very different type of site.
But very interesting nonetheless. Yeah. Okay. If there are no other comments or questions and nothing from our audience, then I think it just leaves me to thank Peter, not only for having stepped into the breach, as it were, at short notice, but for an excellent presentation and a really interesting romp through the origins of the project that goes so far back. And despite some of the, one might call them derogatory comments from some of our elder statesmen in the past, beginning to prove them not necessarily wrong, but at least put them right, let's say. Yeah. So, Peter, on behalf of the RAI, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for the product you've provided on the back of our grant aid. I know we aren't the only supporter, and we look forward to hearing sometime in the future how things go.
Right, thank you very much.
Congratulations and well done.
Thank you. I will say that if you want to follow this project, we've got a very vigorous Facebook page, Petuaria Revisited, which is on Facebook, and Martin Credle and Matthew Parks are the main people producing all sorts of information, not only about our project, but other things Roman to interest people. So there are also the videos of the excavation, all sorts of things on there, and I do recommend that people follow that. So Petuaria Revisited on Facebook.
Okay, that's certainly one to watch. Well, thank you very much indeed, Peter.
Well, thank you very much again to the RAI for allowing me to do this lecture and for your funding.
Okay.